The air in the grand dining room was thick with the scent of roasted duck, rosemary, and the faint, expensive perfume of women who had never known a day of true labor. It was Christmas Eve, and the Vance estate was glowing with the kind of artificial warmth that only immense wealth can buy. I sat there, tracing the rim of my crystal water glass, watching my aunt, Eleanor Thorne, carve the bird with the precision of a surgeon. She was the matriarch, a woman who had turned a struggling shipping line into a global logistics empire. I waited for the right moment, a lull in the conversation about offshore accounts and summer homes. "Eleanor," I said, my voice cutting through the soft clink of silverware, "I wanted to tell you how much I appreciate the gift. The vintage typewriter. It was certainly a surprise, a bit dusty, and the B key is completely snapped off, but the sentiment of giving me an heirloom was noted." The room went silent. Eleanor froze, the silver carving knife hovering an inch above the mahogany table. She looked at me, her sharp blue eyes narrowing behind her designer glasses. "A typewriter, Maya. What on earth are you talking about?" I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine, the kind of professional instinct I usually reserved for tracking international money launderers. I leaned back, my expression carefully neutral. "The one Mom delivered to my apartment last week. She said it was from you. A family relic to help me unplug from my screens." Eleanor set the knife down with a controlled, rhythmic click. She didn't look at me. She looked directly at my mother, Lydia, who was suddenly very interested in the texture of her mashed potatoes. "Lydia." Eleanor's voice was like a low-frequency hum, the kind that precedes an earthquake. "I didn't give Maya a broken typewriter. I told you specifically that I had transferred $750,000 into the trust account I set up for her. I told you to give her the access codes so she could finally buy that house she wanted in the hills. $750,000, Lydia. Not a piece of scrap metal." Across the table, my younger sister, Chloe, let out a choked sound. She had been sipping a vintage Bordeaux, and a dark red stain blossomed across the front of her cream-colored silk blouse. She didn't move to clean it. Her eyes were fixed on Eleanor, wide with a terror so pure it was almost beautiful. My mother's hand, draped in gold bracelets, began to tremble. She reached for her wine glass, her knuckles white, but she couldn't bring herself to meet anyone's gaze. 750,000. I repeated the number slowly, letting it hang in the air like a guillotine, because what arrived at my door was a 1940s Remington with a rusted carriage and a missing ribbon. "Mom told me you were worried I was losing my touch with reality by spending too much time in the digital world. She said you wanted me to have something grounded." Silence didn't just fall over the room, it suffocated it. Eleanor Thorne was not a woman you lied to. She was a woman who had built a kingdom on the backs of iron-clad contracts and absolute loyalty. I watched as the confusion in her eyes shifted into a searing, white-hot clarity. "Lydia," Eleanor said, her voice dropping an octave, "explain to me how nearly $1 million turned into a broken typewriter." My mother's mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. She looked at Chloe, pleading, but Chloe was frantically tapping at her phone under the table, her thumbs moving with a desperate, manic speed. She looked like someone trying to delete their entire life before the lights came on. As a senior forensic data analyst for the federal government, I don't believe in coincidences. I believe in patterns. I believe in the trail left behind by greed. And as I sat there in the flickering candlelight of a deceptive Christmas dinner, the pattern began to form. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a calculated, cold-blooded heist, and it had been executed by my own blood. My mind raced back to 2 weeks prior. I had been in my home office, a sterile environment of high-end servers and triple-monitor setups, deep diving into a complex crypto scam originating out of Eastern Europe. My phone had buzzed, a text from Chloe.
"Hey sis."
Mom and I were thinking, "You've been working so hard lately. Maybe skip the Christmas Eve gala this year. The travel is such a hassle, and you look so tired on Zoom."
"We can just send your gifts through the mail,"
Rest up, you deserve it. It was the first time in 10 years Chloe had shown any interest in my well-being. My sister was a professional socialite, an influencer who lived for the flash of a camera and the validation of a million strangers. She didn't do worry. She did branding. I had replied that I'd think about it, but the dissonance bothered me. Then, 3 days later, the delivery arrived. A heavy cardboard box, taped shut with an excessive amount of packing stings. Inside was the typewriter. It was pathetic. It smelled of damp basements and neglect. There was a note from my mother, from Aunt Eleanor. She wants you to remember where the Vance family started, with words, not wires. Use it well. I had looked at that piece of junk and felt a hollow ache in my chest. I thought my aunt, the woman I admired most, had finally turned cold toward me. I thought I had been cast out of the inner circle. But now, seeing Eleanor's fury, I realized the typewriter wasn't a gift. It was a decoy, a placeholder to keep me from asking questions while the real treasure was funneled elsewhere. I looked at Chloe. Over the last month, her Instagram feed had been a fever dream of opulence. She had posted a video of herself stepping into a midnight, blue Porsche 911 Turbo, the engine roaring with a sound that cost more than my entire education. The caption read, "Manifesting my own destiny. Hard work pays off." A self-made Vimboscala. Then there was the ring, a 4-carat canary diamond that she flashed in every story, claiming it was a pre-engagement gift to herself. Chloe. I said, my voice steady, professional. That Porsche you've been driving, the one you said you bought with your brand deal from that French skincare line, how much was the down payment on that? Chloe snapped her head up, her face pale. That's none of your business, Maya! You've always been jealous of my success because you spend your life staring at green text on a black screen while I actually live! I don't just stare at text, Chloe, I said, leaning forward. I track movement. I track the flow of energy. And right now, the energy in this room is screaming. Eleanor's gaze shifted to Chloe, the Porsche. I saw the photos. I assumed your little internet business was finally turning a profit. But Lydia, you had the power of attorney for Maya's trust while she was on that assignment in Singapore last month. I gave you the authority to move the funds into her primary account. My mother finally found her voice, though it was thin and brittle. Sandra, Eleanor, it was an investment. Maya doesn't need that much money all at once. She's stable. She has a government salary. Chloe was at a turning point. She needed the capital to launch her lifestyle brand. We were going to pay Maya back with interest. It was a family loan. A loan requires the consent of the lender, Lydia. Eleanor barked. What you did is called grand larceny. It's not stealing if it stays in the family. My mother cried, her facade finally cracking. Maya has everything. She's the smart one, the successful one. Chloe was drowning in debt, trying to keep up appearances. I couldn't let her fail. I redirected the funds. It's all for the Vance legacy. I felt a strange sense of detachment. This was my mother, the woman who had tucked me in and read me stories, admitting she had erased my future to fund my sister's vanity. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a slim, foldable tablet. I had come prepared. I hadn't known the amount, but I had known something was wrong. Mom, I said, opening the device. I didn't just come here for dinner. I spent the last 48 hours doing what I do best. I didn't need a search warrant for my own accounts. I turned the screen so Eleanor could see it. On December 12th, the $750,000 hit my account. 6 hours later, a series of 10 transfers, each just under the $10,000 reporting limit to avoid federal flags, was initiated. They went to a shell corporation called Vance Media. From there, the money was dispersed. $200,000 for the Porsche, $150,000 for a deposit on a penthouse lease in Tribeca, $80,000 for the diamond ring, and the rest. Well, the rest went into a high-yield savings account in Chloe's name. Chloe stood up so fast her chair toppled over. You spied on me! You hacked my accounts! That's illegal! I didn't have to hack anything, Chloe, I said calmly. You used my name as the secondary beneficiary on the shell company. You were so arrogant, or perhaps just so lazy, that you thought I wouldn't notice a company using my own social security number to verify its tax ID. You didn't just steal my money. You used my identity to launder it. The color drained from my mother's face. She looked at Eleanor, her eyes searching for a mercy that wasn't there. Eleanor Thorne was a woman who valued the integrity of the ledger above all else. I gave that money to Maya because she earned it, Eleanor said, her voice trembling with a different kind of rage, the rage of a benefactor who had been spat upon. I watched her work 20-hour days. I watched her sacrifice her personal life to protect people she'll never meet. And you took that sacrifice and turned it into a car and a ring? At that moment, the heavy oak doors of the dining room opened. Julian Sterling, Chloe's fiancé, walked in. He was a man of old money, impeccable tailoring, and a reputation for being obsessively concerned with his family's standing. He had been in the library finishing a business call. "Is everything all right?" Julian asked, sensing the freezing temperature of the room. I heard shouting, "Julian, darling!" Chloe ran to him, grabbing his arm. "Maya is being insane. She's accusing me of things. She's trying to ruin our engagement because she's lonely and bitter." I looked at Julian. He was a decent man, if a bit sheltered. "Julian," I said, "before you marry into this, you might want to look at the registration for that Porsche you've been bragging about. It wasn't bought with influencer money. It was bought with stolen funds." My stolen funds? Julian looked at Chloe, then at the screen on the table. He was a hedge fund manager. He knew how to read a ledger. As his eyes scanned the transfers, his expression shifted from confusion to a cold, distant disgust. He slowly uncoupled Chloe's hand from his arm. "Chloe," he said softly, "you told me your aunt had given you a legacy gift for your business. You told me you were an equal partner in our future. Was any of it true?" "Julian, I did it for us," she wailed. "I needed to be on your level. I couldn't just be the poor sister." "You aren't on my level," Julian said, his voice devoid of emotion. "My family values discretion and honor. You are a common thief." He looked at me, gave a short, pained nod of apology, and walked out of the room. We heard the front door heavy, thud shut seconds later. Chloe collapsed into her chair, sobbing hysterically. But these weren't tears of guilt. They were the tears of a child who had lost her favorite toy. My mother was hovering over her, stroking her hair, still glaring at me as if I were the villain in this play. "You've destroyed her, Maya." My mother hissed. "Are you happy? You've ruined your sister's life over some numbers on a screen." "You have plenty." "Why couldn't you just let her have this?" "Because it wasn't yours to give, Mom," I said, "and it wasn't hers to take." Eleanor stood up. She looked older than she had an hour ago, but her resolve was absolute. She picked up her phone and pressed a speed dial button. "Yes, this is Eleanor Thorne. I need a security team at the Vance estate immediately. And call my attorney. Tell him we are filing a formal criminal complaint for identity theft and grand larceny." "Yes, tonight." "Eleanor, no!" my mother screamed. "She's your niece. I'm your sister." "You ceased being my sister the moment you forged my niece's signature to facilitate a crime," Eleanor said. She looked at me, her eyes softening for a fleeting second. "Maya, I am so sorry. I should have handled this directly with you. I trusted the wrong people." The next hour was a blur of blue and red lights reflecting off the snow outside. The security team Eleanor had called arrived, followed shortly by the local police. In a small town like this, the Thorne name carried weight, and the officers moved with a somber efficiency. I watched from the window as my mother and sister were led out. There were no handcuffs, not yet, but the shame was visible in the way they shielded their faces from the neighbors' curious eyes. The self-made influencer was being escorted into the back of a cruiser, her silk blouse stained with wine, her diamond ring confiscated as evidence. The house grew quiet. The fire in the hearth was dying down, the embers glowing a soft, angry orange. Eleanor and I sat at the table, the half-eaten duck still sitting in the center. "What happens now?" I asked. Now, Eleanor said, the law takes its course. Your mother will likely face a suspended sentence if she cooperates, but her reputation is finished. Chloe. Well, Chloe will have to learn what it's like to live without a safety net. The shell company will be liquidated, the assets seized. You'll get your money back, Maya, every cent. It's not about the money, Eleanor, I said, and for the first time that night my voice cracked. I thought they loved me. They loved the idea of you, Eleanor said, reaching across the table to take my hand. They loved the security you provided, the pride you brought to the name. But they didn't love the person. Greed has a way of erasing the person and replacing them with a shadow. You are not a shadow, Maya. You are the light that exposed them. In the months that followed, the fallout was more extensive than I had anticipated. The story broke in the social circles Chloe had spent years cultivating. The Vance scandal became a cautionary tale of social climbing gone wrong. My mother's friends vanished. The country club memberships were revoked. My father, who had been on a business trip in London during that fateful Christmas Eve, returned to a shattered home. He was a quiet man, a scholar who had stayed out of the family's financial maneuverings. When he saw the evidence, when he realized his wife had systematically robbed their eldest daughter to fuel the youngest's delusions, he did the only thing an honorable man could do. He filed for divorce. He couldn't look at Lydia without seeing the forged signatures. Chloe tried to pivot, of course. She tried to make a comeback video, casting herself as a victim of a controlling, high-tech sister. But the internet is a fickle beast. The same people who had liked her photos now delighted in her downfall. The comment sections were a bloodbath of "Where's the Porsche?" and "Typewriter Queen." She eventually deleted her accounts and disappeared into a low-rent apartment in a city where no one knew her name, working a service job she loathed. My mother spent a year under house arrest, a sentence that was perhaps crueler than prison for a woman who lived for social gatherings. She was trapped in a house that reminded her of everything she had lost, with only her own reflections for company. As for me, I didn't buy the house in the hills. Not right away. I took the $750,000 and I did something else. I started a non-profit foundation dedicated to helping victims of elder financial abuse and family orchestrated identity theft. I used my skills to build a shield for people who didn't have a voice, for people who had been betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect them. A year later, on a crisp autumn morning, I was driving through the city. I wasn't driving a Porsche. I had bought a sturdy, elegant Volvo, safe, reliable, and entirely mine. I pulled up to a stoplight and looked at the car in the lane next to me. It was a midnight, blue 911 Turbo, identical to the one Chloe had stolen. I looked at the driver, a young woman, smiling, her hands relaxed on the wheel. For a second, I felt a pang of the old bitterness. But then I looked at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked at the calm in my eyes, the strength in my posture. I wasn't the girl who had been given a broken typewriter anymore. I was the woman who had survived the fire and come out forged in steel. The light turned green. I pressed the accelerator. The engine hummed with a quiet, honest power, and I drove forward into a life that was finally, indisputably, my own. The memory of that Christmas Eve began to fade, replaced by the rhythm of my new reality. I spent my weekends at Eleanor's estate, not as a guest under scrutiny, but as a partner in a legacy that was finally built on truth. We would sit on her terrace, looking out over the harbor, the salt air cleaning the lingering scent of old betrayals from our lungs. One afternoon, Eleanor handed me a small, wrapped box. "This isn't a legacy gift," she said with a smirk. "And it's definitely not a typewriter." I opened it to find a simple, heavy iron key. "It's to the archives of the Thorne shipping offices," she explained. "I'm retiring, Maya. I don't want someone who just understands money to take over. I want someone who understands the truth behind the numbers. I want you to run the foundation and the oversight committee for the empire." I looked at the key, then at her. "You're asking me to be the gatekeeper?" I'm asking you to be the heart, she corrected, because you're the only one who knows what it costs when the heart is missing. I took the key, its weight solid and grounding, in my palm. My mother and sister had tried to build a world out of sand and mirrors, a world that collapsed the moment a single light was shone upon it. But I had built something different. I had built a life on the foundation of the very thing they feared most, the truth. As the sun set over the water, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, I realized that the 750,000 hadn't been the real gift. The real gift had been the moment the key on that rusted typewriter stayed silent, the moment the lie failed, and I was forced to find my own voice. I stood up, walked to the edge of the terrace, and looked out at the horizon. The world was vast, complicated, and full of people trying to hide their tracks. But I wasn't afraid. I was a tracer of paths, a seeker of signals in the noise. And as long as I lived, the truth would always have a place to call home. The journey from that dining room to this terrace had been paved with glass, but I had come through it without a single scar that I wasn't proud of. Every forged signature, every whispered lie, every stolen dollar had been a lesson. And the final lesson was this: you can steal a person's money, you can steal their name, and you can even steal their time, but you can never, ever steal their integrity. That is the one currency that never devalues, and the only one that truly matters when the lights go out. I went back inside the house, the iron key tucked safely in my pocket. The silence of the halls was no longer suffocating, it was peaceful. It was the silence of a house where nothing was hidden, where the air was clear, and where the family, what was left of it, finally knew exactly who they were. A few weeks later, I received a letter. It was from a prison in a neighboring state. No return name, just a familiar, cramped handwriting on a cheap envelope. I sat at my desk, the one with the high-end monitors and the encrypted drives, and I stared at it for a long time. I knew what it was before I opened it. It would be an apology that wasn't an apology. It would be a list of excuses, a plea for family unity, a request for a small loan, to help get things back on track once the sentence was served. I could almost smell the desperation through the paper. I didn't open it. I didn't need to read the words to know they were hollow. I walked over to the small shredder in the corner of my office, the one I used for old bank statements and sensitive data packets. I fed the envelope into the teeth of the machine. The sound was a soft, rhythmic whir. In seconds, the letter was nothing but white ribbons of confetti, unreadable and powerless. I emptied the bin into the trash and sat back down. The digital world waited for me, a vast ocean of data where I could make a difference. I logged into my terminal, the blue light reflected in my eyes. There was a new case on my desk, a series of suspicious wire transfers hitting a charity for orphaned children. Someone was skimming from the vulnerable, thinking they were too smart to be caught. I cracked my knuckles, a ghost of a smile playing on my lips. They were wrong. They were always wrong. Because people like that always forget one thing. There is always someone watching the numbers. And this time, the numbers had a name. I began to type, the keys clicking with a sharp, clear resonance. It was the sound of justice. It was the sound of a story that finally had the right ending. And as the first line of code scrolled across the screen, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. The past was a closed file, archived and encrypted. The future was an open ledger, and I was the one holding the pen. And this time, the signature would be real. The legacy of the Vance family had been rewritten. It wasn't a legacy of greed or social climbing or stolen cars. It was a legacy of accountability. It was a legacy of the daughter who stayed behind to fix what was broken, and the aunt who knew that true wealth isn't what you have, but what you refuse to lose. As I worked late into the night, the only sound in the room was the steady, confident beat of my own heart. I was Maya Vance, and I was no longer defined by what was taken from me. I was defined by what I chose to protect, and in that realization, I found a peace that $750,000 could never buy. I found the freedom of being unburdened by the lies of others. I found the strength to walk my own path, even when it was lonely. The typewriter sat on a shelf in the corner of my office, cleaned and polished, though still broken. I kept it there as a monument, not to the aunt who didn't send it, and not to the mother who did. I kept it as a monument to the day I stopped being a victim and started being a victor. It was a reminder that sometimes the most broken things are the ones that lead us to the most beautiful truths. And as I looked at it one last time before turning off the lights, I whispered a silent thank you, not for the gift, but for the clarity. The world outside was dark, but the path ahead was clear. I stepped out of the office, locked the door, and walked into the cool night air, ready for whatever the next chapter held. The story was complete, the debts were paid, and the ledger was finally perfectly balanced. Life has a funny way of coming full circle. Years later, I found myself back at that mahogany table for another Christmas Eve. Eleanor was older now, her hands a bit more fragile, but her spirit was as indomitable as ever. My father was there too, looking younger, his face free of the tension that had once defined it. There were new faces too, colleagues from the foundation, friends who had become family, people who valued the same things I did. The air still smelled of roast duck and rosemary, but the warmth in the room was real this time. It wasn't bought, it was built. We didn't talk about the scandal. We didn't talk about the people who weren't there. Their names had become footnotes in a much larger, much better story. We talked about the lives we had changed, the systems we had fixed, and the future we were building together. As the clock struck midnight, Eleanor raised her glass. "To the truth," she said, her voice steady and proud. "To the truth," we all echoed, and as I sipped my wine, I felt a deep, resonant sense of belonging. I wasn't the smart one, or the successful one anymore. I was just Maya, and that was more than enough. The cycle of betrayal had been broken, replaced by a cycle of trust, and as the snow began to fall outside, covering the world in a blanket of pure, silent white, I knew that some things are worth more than any amount of money. Some things, like honor and family and the quiet peace of a clear conscience, are truly priceless. The typewriter remained in my office, but I had long since stopped looking at the snapped-off E. I didn't need it to spell out the words that mattered. I had learned to write them with my life. Integrity, justice, love, those were the words that defined me now. And no matter how many times someone tried to steal the keys, the message would always get through. The signals were clear, the trail was solid, and the heart was whole. The story had reached its final page, and as I closed my eyes that night, I knew it was a masterpiece. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. And in a world of decoys and rusted machines, honesty is the greatest gift of all. I woke up the next morning to the sound of birds in the garden. The world was new, the air was fresh, and the day was mine. I went to the kitchen, made a cup of coffee, and sat by the window. The midnight blue Volvo was parked in the driveway, a light dusting of snow on its hood. It was a good car, an honest car, and as I watched the sun rise over the hills, I knew that I had everything I ever needed. I had my name, I had my soul, and I had the truth. Everything else was just data, and data, as I had learned, can always be managed. But the human spirit, that is something that cannot be calculated, cannot be forged, and can never, ever be stolen. I took a sip of my coffee and smiled. The fire was out, the guests were gone, and the house was quiet. But for the first time in my life, the silence didn't feel like a void. It felt like a victory. The saga of the legacy grant was over, and the hunt for the truth was done. And as I looked out at the horizon, I knew that the best parts of the story were yet to come. I was ready. I was Maya Vance. And I was finally home. The quietude of the morning was a luxury I hadn't often allowed myself. For so long, my life had been measured in byte rates and security protocols, in the frantic pulse of a world that never sleeps. But here, in this moment, there was only the steam from my mug and the slow, deliberate movement of the shadows across the floor. I thought briefly of Chloe. I wondered if she ever looked at the sunrises and felt the same peace, or if she was still chasing the ghost of still trying to fill a hole that money could never bridge. I hoped, in a way that only someone who has truly moved on can, that she found her own version of the truth. Not the one she bought, but the one she earned. My mother, too, was a distant thought. I had forgiven her not because she asked for it, but because carrying the weight of her betrayal was an expense I could no longer afford. Forgiveness, I realized, was the ultimate forensic cleanup. It cleared the cache, deleted the temporary files of anger, and let the system run at full speed again. I finished my coffee and stood up. I had a busy day ahead. There were meetings at the foundation, a new set of data to analyze for the committee, and a dinner with my father to discuss a book he was writing. A book about the history of the Thorne family, the real history, this time. As I walked toward my office to start the day, I passed the typewriter one last time. I reached out and touched the cold, black metal of the frame. It was a piece of junk, yes. It was a tool of deception, true. But it was also the catalyst that had set me free. I realized then that the most valuable gifts don't always come in trusts or luxury cars. Sometimes, the most valuable gift is the one that forces you to stand up and say, no more. The typewriter wasn't a gift from Eleanor, and it wasn't a gift from Lydia. It was a gift from the universe. A rusted, broken, beautiful reminder that I was stronger than any lie. I walked into my office, sat down at my desk, and woke up the monitors. The blue light filled the room, familiar and welcoming. I looked at the first task on my list and began to type. The keys of my modern keyboard were silent, but in my mind, they sounded like thunder. Each stroke was a commitment. Each line of code was a promise. I was Maya Vance. I was a seeker of truth, and my story was just beginning. The world outside continued its frantic pace, but inside the walls of my life, there was a steady, unshakable rhythm. It was the sound of a life lived with intention. It was the sound of a woman who had reclaimed her destiny. As the morning sun climbed higher, flooding the room with light, I knew that no matter what challenges came my way, I had the tools to handle them. I had the logic to see through the noise, the courage to follow the trail, and the heart to know when I had arrived. The legacy was safe, the ledger was balanced, and the future was bright. I hit the enter key, and the data began to flow. Everything was exactly as it should be. The light reflected off the polished wood of the desk, and for a second, the office seemed to glow with an ethereal clarity. In that light, the old typewriter looked less like junk and more like an ornament, a strange and perfect piece of art. It was a reminder that every story has its shadows, but it's the light we choose to follow that defines the end. I leaned back in my chair, took a deep breath, and smiled. The truth was out there, and I was the one who found it. The end of the road had turned out to be the beginning of the journey, and what a journey it was going to be. No more forged signatures. No more broken promises. Just the clear, honest path ahead. I focused on the screen, my fingers flying across the keys, and I let the work carry me forward. This was my life. This was my truth, and it was beautiful. As the hours passed and the day unfolded, I felt a sense of profound gratitude. Not for the money, not for the car, but for the clarity that comes from knowing exactly who you are and where you stand. I was Maya Vance, and I was finally truly free. The typewriter sat on the shelf, a silent witness to a battle won. And as the sun reached its zenith, the key didn't seem so broken anymore. It seemed like a badge of honor, a reminder that even when things are missing, the story goes on. And sometimes, the missing pieces are exactly what you need to find the whole. I looked at the screen, at the numbers and the names and the connections. It was a world I understood, a world I could protect. And in that protection, I found my purpose. The story was complete. The circle was closed. And as I worked, I knew that the next time I sat at a Thanksgiving or Christmas table, I wouldn't be looking for gifts. I would be looking at the faces of the people I loved, knowing that the greatest gift of all was the trust we held between us. A trust that was earned. A trust that was real. And a trust that would never, ever be broken again. The signal was strong, the connection was secure, and the life I had built was mine to keep, always.